After 5 years as just the secretary at my father's failing company, I secretly transformed it into a $50 million success. At the executive board meeting, my father looked at me and said dismissively, "Remember your place, Ava. You're just the secretary." My heart froze, but I smiled politely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The next morning, when I revealed my ownership papers, everything changed. I still remember the exact moment my world shifted. The boardroom was immaculate as always, polished mahogany table gleaming under recessed lighting, leather chairs filled with men in expensive suits, and the faint scent of coffee mixing with cologne. Halcyon Technologies' quarterly meeting was usually a predictable affair, but this one was different. This was the meeting where my father would announce the new CEO. For 5 years, I'd worked behind the scenes at my father's technology company. Edward Halcyon had always introduced me as my daughter, the secretary. Not the Stanford MBA graduate, not the strategy consultant who'd worked for 3 Fortune 500 companies, just the secretary. Initially, it had stung, but over time, I saw the advantage in being underestimated. When I first joined Halcyon Technologies, it was hemorrhaging money, outdated products, disorganized management, and a toxic culture that drove away talent. My father and brother James were too proud to acknowledge the company's decline, clinging to my grandfather Clarence's original vision while the technology world sprinted ahead without them. So I made a choice. If they wouldn't see me as an executive, I'd use my secretary position as cover to save the company. I stayed late reviewing financials no one bothered to check. I redirected resources while organizing files. I cultivated relationships with clients while taking notes in meetings. I identified promising engineers and quietly promoted them while updating the company directory. Within 2 years, our failing product lines were replaced with innovative solutions I'd conceived and secretly shepherded through development. Within 3, our client list had tripled, and our stock had stabilized. By year 5, Halcyon Technologies had transformed from a $5 million struggling legacy company to a $50 million industry innovator, and no one knew I was responsible. Not the board, not our clients, not even our employees. Every success was attributed to James's visionary leadership, despite his spending most days on golf courses and yachts, while I rebuilt the company brick by brick. My grandfather, Clarence, had founded Halcyon with nothing but determination and brilliant ideas. I'd watched him work when I was young, perched on his office couch with books while he transformed the technology landscape. "Remember, Ava," he'd tell me, eyes twinkling, "people will underestimate you. Let them. It gives you the freedom to surprise them later." I thought of his words often over the years, especially when I discovered he'd been secretly mentoring me. The projects he gave me as a teenager weren't just to keep me busy, as my father assumed. They were training, financial analysis, market research, product development. Clarence saw something in me that my father refused to acknowledge, but Clarence had been gone 3 years now, and this board meeting was supposed to be the culmination of my hidden work. The company had reached a critical inflection point. We needed decisive leadership to capitalize on our growth. Though my father remained chairman, his health was declining, and everyone knew he was preparing to name a successor as CEO. "Gentlemen," my father began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone honed over 40 years of leadership. "Halcyon stands at a crossroads today. Our remarkable recovery and growth demand forward-thinking leadership." I kept my expression neutral, hands steady as I pretended to take notes. This was it, the moment when surely my father would acknowledge the truth. During our private dinner last week, he'd hinted at big changes and recognizing true leadership. I'd allowed myself, just briefly, to hope he'd finally seen through his bias. "James has been groomed for this position his entire life," my father continued, gesturing to my brother, who sat straighter in his chair. He understands Halcyon's legacy and has the vision to take us forward. The room broke into applause as James stood, straightening his custom suit with a practiced motion. I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach, but kept my face carefully blank. 5 years of practice hiding my emotions served me well in this moment. "Thank you, Father," James said, voice confident despite his complete lack of qualification. "I'm honored to accept this responsibility and continue our family's legacy." I watched as board members nodded appreciatively. None of them knew that. James couldn't explain how our newest technology worked, couldn't name our top 5 clients, and certainly couldn't identify which product lines were driving our growth. Additionally, my father continued, "We'll be bringing in Cora Matthews as COO to support James during this transition. Her experience at Vertex Systems will be invaluable." This was unexpected. Cora Matthews was indeed experienced, but she was also my former college roommate who'd recently been pushed out of Vertex in a political power struggle. We'd stayed in touch, and I knew she was brilliant, but I also knew my father was only hiring her because she was James's fiancée. A fact they'd kept carefully hidden from the public. As the meeting concluded, various board members approached James with congratulations. I gathered my notebook and pen, preparing to slip out quietly as usual. But my father's voice stopped me. "Ava, we'll need coffee for the executive session afterward, and make sure those quarterly reports are properly filed." Something in me snapped. 5 years of invisibility, of using my Stanford MBA to serve coffee, of watching my innovations attributed to others, it all crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. "Of course, Father," I replied, voice pleasant. "Anything else?" He glanced at me, already turning away. "Remember your place, Ava. You're just the secretary." My brother James snickered, not even bothering to hide his contempt. The board members pretended not to notice the exchange, their discomfort evident only in their suddenly intense interest in their phones and tablets. I smiled politely, the perfect picture of the accommodating secretary. But inside, a decision crystallized. My grandfather's voice seemed to whisper in my ear, "The time for hiding is over, Ava." That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I prepared. I reviewed documents I'd kept secured for years. I made calls to people whose loyalty I had carefully cultivated. I finalized arrangements that had been waiting for precisely this moment. By morning, I was ready. This wouldn't just be a confrontation, it would be a reckoning. They had dismissed me as just the secretary for the last time. My journey at Halcyon Technologies began long before I took the role of secretary. To understand how I ended up, silently running a company while being treated as nothing more than an administrative assistant, you need to understand where it all started. Halcyon wasn't always the sleek tech company it is today. My grandfather Clarence founded it in his garage in 1978, back when personal computing was still in its infancy. He was a visionary who saw the potential of technology to transform how businesses operated. With nothing but determination and a second mortgage on his modest home, he built the first Halcyon data management system, a revolutionary product for its time. I grew up watching him work, fascinated by the way he could see connections and possibilities that others missed. While my father Edward and brother James viewed the company as a symbol of status, grandfather saw it as a vehicle for innovation. He'd let me sit in his office after school, explaining complex technologies in ways my young mind could grasp. "The future belongs to those who can adapt," he'd tell me. "Never get too comfortable with success, Ava. That's when disruption finds you." By the time I was 15, I was helping him review market analyses and financial projections. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I was genuinely interested. While James was being groomed as the heir apparent with ceremonial titles and public recognition, I was absorbing the actual mechanics of the business. "Your brother craves the spotlight," grandfather told me once, when I asked why James got all the attention. "You crave understanding. That's a far more valuable hunger in the long run." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I took his words to heart, pursuing a business education with single-minded focus. My father viewed my acceptance to Stanford as a nice accomplishment for his daughter, something to mention at cocktail parties, rather than preparation for a serious career. When I graduated with my MBA, he attended the ceremony but spent most of it networking with potential clients rather than celebrating my achievement. "Education is important for a young woman," he said afterward, patting my shoulder. "It makes you well-rounded. Good conversation at dinner parties." I nearly laughed in his face. I hadn't spent 2 years and thousands of hours studying to become well-rounded for dinner parties. I had been preparing to lead. When grandfather's health began failing 5 years ago, the cracks in Halcyon's foundation were already showing. Our flagship products were being outpaced by competitors. Our management structure had grown bloated and inefficient. James, despite his executive title, spent more time cultivating his image than understanding our technology or customers. During one of my last visits with grandfather at the hospital, he gripped my hand with surprising strength. "Halcyon is in trouble," he said, his voice low. "Edward doesn't see it. James doesn't care to look. The company needs someone who understands, both where we've been and where technology is going." "Dad won't listen to me," I said, frustrated. "He still introduces me as his little girl to business associates." A sly smile crossed my grandfather's face. "Sometimes, Ava, the most power comes from being underestimated. Take a position at the company. Any position. Watch. Learn. Build alliances. The rest will follow." When he passed away a week later, I was devastated. The funeral was a grand affair. Clarence Halcyon had been a pillar of the business community, and hundreds attended to pay their respects. My father gave a moving eulogy about carrying on grandfather's legacy. James stood solemnly beside him, the picture of the grieving heir. I stood slightly apart, watching this performance with clear eyes. Neither of them had truly understood grandfather, or his vision for Halcyon. They saw the company as an inheritance, an entitlement. I saw it as a responsibility. 2 weeks after the funeral, I approached my father and asked for a job at Halcyon. "A job?" he repeated, surprised. "But you've been consulting for those big firms in New York." "I want to be part of grandfather's legacy," I said simply. He considered this, then nodded. "I suppose we could find something suitable. Perhaps in HR? Something that wouldn't be too demanding." I bit my tongue. "Actually, I was thinking I could start as your executive assistant, learn the business from the ground up." This appealed to his ego. Having his Stanford MBA daughter serving as his secretary would reinforce his importance. Plus, he assumed I'd eventually get bored and leave for a more prestigious position elsewhere. "Well, if that's what you want," he said with a shrug, "though it seems a waste of your education." Little did he know that being his assistant would give me access to everything: executive meetings, confidential documents, strategic planning, and most importantly, the complete picture of just how badly Halcyon was floundering. Within my first month, I discovered we were 6 months from insolvency unless drastic changes were made. My father and James remained oblivious, maintaining an atmosphere of business as usual. Board meetings were exercises in avoiding uncomfortable truths. Executive decisions were made based on what would look good in the short term, rather than what would ensure our survival. So I began my shadow work. Small changes at first, reorganizing workflows, identifying waste, connecting departments that should have been collaborating all along. I used my position as the invisible secretary to implement changes that no one noticed until they started working. When our lead developer quit in frustration, I personally recruited an innovative replacement, ostensibly just passing along resumes, but in reality conducting the entire hiring process while making the executives believe they had made the decision. When our marketing strategy was failing, I rewrote it entirely and filtered it through various departments so it appeared to be a collaborative effort rather than my creation. For 5 years, I rebuilt Halcyon from within its crumbling walls, piece by careful piece. Every success was attributed to the leadership team. Every innovative solution was credited to departments who had merely implemented my ideas. I became the ghost in the machine, the unseen architect of our revival. And through it all, I was still just the secretary, taking notes, bringing coffee, filing reports, and silently saving the very company my father and brother were driving into the ground. The transformation of Halcyon Technologies didn't happen overnight. It was a careful, methodical process that required strategy, patience, and the willingness to let others take credit for my work. My first priority was understanding exactly how dire our situation was. Under the guise of organizing the filing system, I conducted a comprehensive audit of our finances, products, and client relationships. The results were worse than I'd feared. Our flagship product was 2 generations behind our competitors. Our client retention rate had dropped by 40% in 3 years. Our cash reserves would be depleted within 6 months at our current burn rate. Most concerning was our complete lack of innovation pipeline. While our competitors were developing AI-enhanced solutions and cloud-native architectures, we were still trying to sell marginally improved versions of decade-old software. The R&D department had been systematically gutted to maintain short-term profits, leaving us with little hope for future growth. Armed with this knowledge, I created a 3-phase rescue plan. First, stop the bleeding by cutting unnecessary expenses and stabilizing our core business. Second, revitalize our existing products with targeted improvements to retain current clients. Third, develop new offerings that would position us for future growth. The challenge wasn't developing the plan, it was implementing it without anyone realizing I was the one doing it. I needed to make my father and James believe these ideas were their own, or at least coming from appropriate channels within the organization. I started with small suggestions during meetings, carefully phrased as questions. I was filing the client reports, and I noticed several mentioned similar concerns about the user interface. Has the product team considered simplifying the dashboard? Or, while organizing the budget files, I saw we're spending significantly on 3 different vendors for similar services. Would it make sense to consolidate? Most of my suggestions were initially dismissed, but I'd carefully plant the seeds with multiple people. Eventually, someone else would raise the same point, and suddenly it would be considered a brilliant observation. I learned to celebrate these moments rather than resent them. Each implemented idea meant Halcyon was one step closer to survival. For larger strategic changes, I needed allies. I identified key employees throughout the organization who recognized our problems and wanted to solve them. People who were competent but overlooked, much like me. I built relationships with them through small interactions, remembering their children's names, noticing their contributions in meetings, finding opportunities to connect them with resources they needed. Jacob Chen in product development became my first major ally. He had brilliant ideas for modernizing our software, but had been repeatedly shut down by management. During a coffee run one afternoon, I mentioned that I'd accidentally seen some of his proposal drafts while filing. "Those solutions look really innovative," I said casually. "Have you ever considered presenting them directly to the client implementation team instead of going through normal channels?" He looked surprised. "The secretary is giving me business advice?" I smiled. The secretary sees a lot of things, including which departments actually have budget discretion versus who just likes to act important. That conversation led to Jacob bypassing the traditional approval process and working directly with client-facing teams to implement his improvements. The results were immediate. Client satisfaction scores increased, and renewal rates stabilized. My father and James took credit for the management restructuring that allowed this innovation, never realizing I had orchestrated the entire process. This pattern repeated across departments. I identified talented people, connected them with resources and opportunities, and gradually built a shadow network of employees who were actually running the company effectively while the official leadership enjoyed the results of our work. The financial turnaround began in year 2. Our cost-cutting measures had stemmed the immediate crisis, and our product improvements were retaining valuable clients. I began phase 3, developing new offerings, by connecting our best engineers with industry trends I monitored through careful research. I was organizing the competitive intelligence reports, I would say to our lead engineer, and noticed something interesting about what Vertex Systems is developing. Their approach seems to be focusing on integration capabilities, rather than feature expansion. These observations would spark discussions and eventually new development directions that positioned us ahead of market shifts rather than perpetually behind them. By year 3, we had launched 2 new product lines that quickly became market leaders. Our stock price had tripled. Industry analysts who had written us off as a dying company were now praising Halcyon's remarkable turnaround and visionary leadership. That leadership, of course, meant James. He became the face of our success, giving interviews about his strategic vision and commitment to innovation, concepts he barely understood, much less implemented. My father basked in the validation that his son was indeed the rightful heir to the Halcyon legacy. I continued my work in the shadows, expanding my influence and gradually taking control of more critical functions. I established relationships with our largest clients, initially making contact for scheduling purposes, but eventually becoming their trusted advisor on implementation strategies. I restructured our hiring processes to attract top talent. I initiated strategic partnerships that opened new market opportunities. Throughout it all, I maintained my cover as the efficient but unremarkable secretary. I dressed conservatively, spoke minimally in meetings unless asked direct questions, and perfected the art of being forgettable, present but not noteworthy. I learned that people rarely monitor what they don't perceive as a threat, giving me extraordinary freedom to operate. The most difficult part wasn't the work itself. It was watching my brother take credit for my achievements. Each time he presented my strategies as his own, each time he received applause for results he had nothing to do with, I had to remind myself of the bigger picture. This wasn't about recognition, it was about saving my grandfather's company and legacy. By year 5, Halcyon Technologies had transformed completely. Our valuation had grown from a struggling $5 million to a robust $50 million. We had expanded from regional to national clients. Our products were winning industry awards, and our growth trajectory had made us an attractive investment opportunity. All of this, every dollar of growth, every successful product launch, every saved client relationship, had been orchestrated by the woman everyone still referred to as just the secretary. The woman who took notes, brought coffee, and silently rebuilt an empire while being treated as invisible. But I wasn't invisible anymore, and soon everyone would know it. The quarterly board meeting that changed everything was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Thursday in April. I had spent the previous night preparing a comprehensive analysis of our first quarter performance, a stellar report showing 28% growth year over year and our most successful product launch to date. I had written the report myself, though it would be presented as the work of our executive team. I arrived early as always, setting up the boardroom precisely how my father preferred. Water pitchers filled with exactly 3 ice cubes per glass. Presentation folders aligned at perfect right angles. Coffee service arranged on the credenza. The illusion of competent leadership required attention to these details, details that would be attributed to good staff rather than the strategic mind that had revitalized the entire company. Board members arrived gradually, engaging in the usual pre-meeting banter about golf scores and vacation homes. I greeted each one professionally, most acknowledging me with the polite but dismissive nod reserved for support staff. Only Walter Hargrove, our longest-serving board member and my grandfather's old friend, treated me with genuine warmth. "How are you, Ava?" he asked quietly, hanging back after the others had taken their seats. Very well, thank you, I replied with a smile that held more meaning than anyone else would recognize. He looked at me thoughtfully. Your grandfather would be proud of the company's direction, he said, before adding in a lower voice, and more proud of you than you might realize. Before I could respond, my father entered the room, followed closely by James. Everyone stood in deference, a courtesy extended to the chairman and presumed CEO in waiting. I took my usual seat in the corner, notebook open, pen poised, the perfect image of the attentive secretary. Gentlemen, my father began, surveying the room with the confidence of someone who believed success was his birthright. Today marks a significant milestone for Halcyon Technologies. Our performance has exceeded all expectations, positioning us for a new chapter of growth and leadership. The board members nodded appreciatively, several glancing at the financial summaries I had prepared. Numbers didn't lie, and these numbers told a story of remarkable revival. As you know, my father continued, we've been considering the formal succession plan for some time. James has demonstrated exceptional leadership during our turnaround, and the results speak for themselves. I kept my expression neutral, though something inside me tightened. I had anticipated this announcement, but hearing the blatant misattribution of achievement still stung. Additionally, he said, we're bringing in Cora Matthews as our new Chief Operating Officer. Her experience at Vertex Systems will complement James's vision and strengthen our executive team. I watched as Cora was invited into the room. My former roommate looked polished and confident, shaking hands with board members as she was introduced. Our eyes met briefly. Her expression revealed nothing, though I detected the slightest hesitation before she looked away. With James as CEO and Cora as COO, Halcyon will be positioned for unprecedented growth, my father declared. We anticipate announcing this transition publicly next week, after finalizing the details of their compensation packages. The meeting proceeded with presentations on quarterly performance, strategic initiatives, and market positioning. All materials I had prepared, all credit going to others. I took diligent notes, occasionally rising to refill water glasses or distribute additional documents, playing my role perfectly. Near the end of the meeting, Walter raised a question that caused a subtle shift in the room's energy. These results are impressive, he acknowledged, but I'm curious about the innovation pipeline that's driving our growth. James, could you walk us through the development process for the new enterprise solution? It seems to have been the cornerstone of our market repositioning. James cleared his throat, glancing quickly at our father. Well, we implemented a strategic approach focusing on client-centered development. The technical team executed the roadmap according to the parameters we established. Walter nodded, seemingly innocent in his follow-up. I'm particularly interested in how you identified the integration opportunities that competitors missed. That insight changed our entire market position. I watched James struggle, reaching for vague business jargon to mask his complete lack of understanding. We leveraged cross-functional synergies to identify market gaps and executed accordingly. The room fell silent. Several board members exchanged glances, the emptiness of his response hanging in the air. My father quickly intervened, redirecting the conversation to safer territory, but the damage was done. For perhaps the first time, several board members were seeing the gap between our company's performance and James's actual capabilities. As the meeting concluded, my father approached me while others were gathering their belongings. Ava, Will, need to prepare the press materials for the leadership announcement. Draft something appropriate and have it on my desk by tomorrow. I looked up from my notebook. Of course. Will you want to review the succession documentation as well? He waved dismissively. That's all standard. Legal has the templates from when I took over from your grandfather. Actually, I said carefully, there are several unique provisions in our corporate structure that might require specific attention. My father's expression hardened slightly. The legal department can handle it. Just focus on your administrative duties. James, overhearing, smirked as he approached. Don't worry your pretty head about the complex legal stuff, sis. That's why we have expensive lawyers. Something in his condescending tone, combined with years of watching him take credit for work he didn't understand, finally broke through my carefully maintained composure. I'm quite familiar with the legal intricacies of our corporate structure, I said, my voice calm but firm. Ava, my father warned, irritation visible on his face. Perhaps I should review the succession documentation, I continued. Given my role handling confidential materials— Enough, my father interrupted sharply. Several heads turned our way. Remember your place, Ava. You're just the secretary. The words landed like a physical blow, not because they were new, but because they illuminated with perfect clarity how little I was valued despite everything I had accomplished. 5 years of transforming the company, of creating the very success they were now claiming, reduced to just the secretary. James's smug smile widened as he adjusted his custom-tailored suit. Maybe we can find you a role in Cora's team, he said with false generosity. Something simple enough for your skill set. Board members pretended not to hear this exchange, though Walter's expression darkened perceptibly. Cora looked uncomfortable, but remained silent, her allegiance clearly established. I gathered my materials with steady hands, years of practice controlling my outward reactions. I'll have those press materials ready tomorrow, I said professionally, giving no indication of the seismic shift happening within me. As I walked out of the boardroom, my decision was made. The time for hiding in plain sight was over. My grandfather had left me more than lessons and mentorship. He had left me the tools to claim my rightful place. Tomorrow, my father and brother would learn exactly who had been running Halcyon Technologies for the past 5 years, and what just the secretary was truly capable of. To truly understand the challenge I faced, you need to understand my opposition. This wasn't simply about proving my competence. It was about confronting deeply entrenched forces that had every interest in maintaining the status quo. My father, Edward Halcyon, hadn't always been dismissive of women in business. In fact, my grandfather often told stories of how my grandmother had been instrumental in Halcyon's early success, managing the books and operations while Clarence focused on technology development. But after her death when I was just a child, something changed in my father. He retreated into a more traditional worldview, one where men built businesses and women supported them from the sidelines. By the time I was in high school, he had fully embraced this perspective. When I expressed interest in business classes, he encouraged me, not as professional development, but as a way to understand enough to support your future husband. When I chose Stanford for my MBA instead of marrying my college boyfriend, he treated it as a temporary detour before I settled into my real life. This wasn't just personal bias. It was a fundamental lens through which he viewed the world. And challenging that lens meant challenging his entire identity. James, on the other hand, was a product of this environment. As the only son, he had been told from childhood that Halcyon would someday be his. Not as something to earn, but as something he was entitled to by birth and gender. Every achievement had been celebrated disproportionately, every failure excused as gaining experience. I had watched him coast through our private high school, getting by on charm rather than effort. When he struggled at university, my father hired tutors and made donations to ensure his graduation. When he joined Halcyon straight out of college, he was given the title of Vice President of Strategic Initiatives, a position with no clear responsibilities but significant prestige. What made James particularly dangerous wasn't malice, but incompetence combined with confidence. He genuinely believed he deserved leadership despite having never successfully led anything. His understanding of our technology was superficial at best, gleaned from marketing materials rather than actual product knowledge. His client relationships consisted of expensive dinners and golf outings rather than understanding their business needs. In the 5 years I had been at Halcyon, James had initiated exactly 2 strategic projects. The first, an attempted expansion into government contracting, had wasted millions in pursuit of contracts we weren't qualified to fulfill. The second, an acquisition of a failing competitor, had brought nothing but technical debt and client complaints. Both disasters had been quietly cleaned up by me, working through dedicated team members who understood the actual business. And now Cora Matthews had joined this alliance against me. Cora and I had once been close, roommates at Stanford with seemingly aligned values and ambitions. But our paths had diverged after graduation. While I focused on building substance and skills, Cora had pursued advancement through relationships and image. Her engagement to James came as a shock, not because of any particular affection between them, but because of its obvious strategic advantage for both parties. As COO, Cora would bring a veneer of competence to balance James's obvious limitations. She was articulate, polished, and skilled at taking credit for team successes while distancing herself from failures. At Vertex Systems, she had risen quickly through a combination of genuine talent and careful alliance building, though her departure had been precipitated by a product failure she couldn't deflect blame for. The night after the board meeting, I sat in my apartment reviewing what I knew about my opposition. My father controlled 30% of Halcyon's shares as chairman. James held 15%, a graduation gift he had done nothing to earn. The remaining shares were divided among board members, with 10% held in an employee stock ownership plan I had quietly established 2 years earlier. Their power extended beyond stock ownership. My father had deep relationships with most board members, having served on various committees and civic organizations together for decades. James had cultivated the younger executives, creating a social circle that mixed business and pleasure. Through regular outings and weekend retreats, they also controlled the narrative. To the outside world, the story of Halcyon's revival was already written. A visionary founder whose son had successfully modernized the company for a new era. The press releases were drafted, the business magazine interviews scheduled. The succession, from Edward to James, was presented as the natural order, the expected and rightful transition of power. What they didn't control, however, was the actual operation of the company. Despite appearances, it was my systems, my strategies, and my relationships that kept Halcyon functioning. The developers responded to my product roadmaps. The account managers implemented my client retention programs. The financial structure followed my carefully designed model. Most importantly, they didn't know what my grandfather had done before his death. They didn't know about our private conversations, about the documents he had signed, about the provisions he had quietly inserted into the corporate bylaws during his final months. As I prepared for the confrontation that would change everything, I considered my opposition's greatest weakness. They underestimated me completely. They saw what they expected to see, a compliant woman playing a supporting role. They didn't look deeper because their worldview didn't allow for the possibility that just the secretary could be the true architect of their success. Their dismissal had been my greatest advantage for 5 years. Now, it would be their downfall. That night, I called Walter Hargrove. As my grandfather's oldest friend and business partner, he had watched my growth from curious child to capable businesswoman. More importantly, he had been the witness to my grandfather's final amendments to the corporate structure. "It's time, isn't it?" he asked when he heard my voice. "Yes," I replied. "Tomorrow morning." "He knew this day would come," Walter said, his voice carrying both sadness and pride. "Clarence always said Edward would push too far eventually. Are you ready for the consequences?" I thought about the years of dismissal, of watching my brother take credit for my work, of being relegated to coffee runs despite my qualifications. I thought about my grandfather's legacy being placed in the hands of people who didn't understand or respect it. "I've been ready for 5 years," I answered. "I just hoped it wouldn't be necessary." They won't take this well, Walter warned. Edward has convinced himself that James is his legacy. Challenging that will feel like you're attacking him personally. I know, I said quietly, but Halcyon is more important than his ego or James's entitlement. Clarence would be proud, Walter said, not just of what you're about to do, but of how long you tried to avoid doing it. That shows true leadership, putting the company first, even when it meant swallowing your pride. After we hung up, I gathered the documents I would need for the morning, the original corporate bylaws, the amendments my grandfather had signed, 3 months before his death, the succession provisions that no one had bothered to read carefully, and most importantly, the ownership certificates that would change everything. As I prepared for bed, I felt strangely calm. Tomorrow would be difficult, possibly even ugly, but for the first time in 5 years, I would stop hiding my true role at Halcyon. I would stop pretending to be less than I was. I would reclaim my grandfather's legacy and my own future. Remember your place, Ava, my father had said. You're just the secretary. Tomorrow, he would learn exactly what place my grandfather had intended for me all along. The morning after the board meeting, I arrived at Halcyon headquarters at 6:30 a.m., well before the usual stream of employees would begin their day. The quiet building gave me space to observe and think without maintaining my secretary persona. I walked slowly through the offices, seeing them through new eyes. For 5 years, these spaces had been my chessboard, places where I moved pieces strategically while remaining seemingly peripheral. Now I noticed details that reinforced the power structures I was about to challenge. My father's corner office was a shrine to traditional corporate success. Dark wood furniture, leather-bound business books, most unread, and photographs documenting his handshakes with various dignitaries. Notably absent were any images of actual Halcyon products or team celebrations. The space was designed to project authority, not to facilitate innovation or connection. James's office down the hall mirrored our father's in aspiration, if not achievement. The furnishings were similarly imposing but newer, with modern art he didn't understand, but had been told was valuable. Awards he hadn't earned were prominently displayed. The whiteboard on his wall showed a half-formed strategy mind map in his handwriting, a scatter of buzzwords without coherent connection. The executive floor was physically and symbolically separated from the operational teams by 2 floors and keycard access restrictions I had quietly implemented, not to isolate leadership, as they assumed, but to give our actual innovators freedom from constant executive interference. As I continued my walk, I entered the product development area where our engineers were creating the technology that had revitalized Halcyon. Jacob. Chen's corner workspace was already occupied despite the early hour. His dedication hadn't gone unnoticed or unrewarded in my shadow organization. I had ensured he received equity, resources, and the freedom to innovate without bureaucratic obstacles. Early morning or late night? I asked, causing him to look up from his monitor with surprise. Ava, both actually. The integration module for the new healthcare vertical is giving me trouble. He glanced around before continuing in a lower voice. I tried to schedule a meeting with James to get approval for additional development resources, but his assistant said he's booked with strategic planning all week. I had seen James's actual calendar. The strategic planning was a golf retreat with potential investors who were being courted based on our recent performance created by people like Jacob. What if resources weren't an issue? I asked carefully. What would you need to make this integration successful? Jacob looked at me curiously. 2 more senior developers and about 3 weeks of focused work. But that's not going to happen with the current approval process. I nodded. Things change, Jacob, sometimes more quickly than we expect. As I continued my assessment, I visited each department that had been instrumental in Halcyon's transformation. the client success team led by Amelia Rhodes, who had implemented my retention strategies without realizing I was their author. The finance department, where Piper Williams had executed my cost optimization plans, believing they came from official leadership channels. The marketing team that had brilliantly executed campaigns based on positioning documents I had routed to them from executive brainstorming sessions that never actually occurred. Each conversation reinforced what I already knew. Halcyon functioned because of a shadow network of competent professionals who had been empowered through my behind-the-scenes efforts. They didn't know I was their true leader, but they recognized that something in the organization was working despite, not because of, the official executive team. By 8 a.m., employees were arriving in greater numbers. I shifted back into my secretary persona, greeting people professionally while observing their interactions. The news of James's upcoming CEO appointment and Cora's addition to the executive team had spread quickly. The reactions were telling. Among the senior staff, there was performative enthusiasm, congratulatory emails, verbal support in public spaces, careful alignment with the new power structure. But in quieter corners, I observed concern. Worried. Glances between department heads. Hushed conversations that stopped when others approached. Several key employees checking their phones with the particular focus that suggested updating resumes or reaching out to contacts about new opportunities. Most revealing was the middle management layer, the people who actually kept projects moving and teams functioning. They weren't updating resumes yet, but their body language showed resignation rather than enthusiasm. They had been through leadership changes before and knew that James's promotion likely meant more emphasis on appearance than substance, more pressure for quick results rather than sustainable growth. As I returned to my desk outside my father's office, I noted who stopped by to establish early connections with the new regime: the internal politicians, the sycophants, the people, whose advancement had always depended more on relationships than results. They brought coffee to James, laughed too loudly at his jokes, and asked how they could support his vision. By 8:45 a.m., I had a clear map of the human terrain I was navigating. I knew who might secretly applaud my challenge to the status quo. I knew who would oppose me out of self-interest regardless of what was best for Halcyon. Most importantly, I knew who would wait to see which way the wind blew before choosing a side. I also observed Cora's first morning as the incoming COO. She arrived at 8:30, immaculately dressed and projecting confidence. She had already scheduled meetings with department heads, clearly establishing her authority before it was officially announced. When she saw me at my desk, she paused. "Ava," she acknowledged with professional courtesy but careful distance. "Could you show me to the main conference room? I'm meeting with the product team at 9. "Of course," I replied, maintaining my helpful secretary persona. "I've taken the liberty of preparing the quarterly performance data you'll need for that discussion." "That's thoughtful," she said, slight confusion crossing her face. "I didn't realize that would be part of your responsibilities." "I try to anticipate needs," I said simply. "It helps things run smoothly." As I walked her to the conference room, she lowered her voice. "I hope there are no hard feelings about the arrangement with James. It's just business, you understand?" Smiled politely. "Everything at Halcyon is just business, Cora. Some of us simply take the business more seriously than others." Her expression hardened slightly before she composed herself. "I've always respected your dedication," she said carefully. "Perhaps we can find you a more suitable role in the new structure, something that better uses your Stanford education." "That's an interesting suggestion," I replied as we reached the conference room. "I think we'll all find ourselves in more suitable roles very soon." She gave me a puzzled look, but was distracted by James's arrival. He barely acknowledged my presence, focusing entirely on Cora as they entered the conference room together, already discussing how they would restructure the department they were about to meet. I returned to my desk and checked the time. 8:55 a.m. My father would arrive at 9 on the dot, as he had every day for 30 years. The documents I needed were arranged perfectly on my desk, hidden beneath the morning correspondence I would normally present for his review. The assessment was complete. The opposition was exactly as expected, confident, entrenched, and completely unprepared for what was about to happen. The potential allies were in place, though they didn't yet know they were allies. The battleground was familiar territory that I had mapped more thoroughly than anyone realized. At precisely 9 a.m., the elevator doors opened, and my father stepped out, briefcase in hand. It was time. What no one at Halcyon understood, what they couldn't possibly have imagined, was that I had been preparing for this confrontation since before I even joined the company. The true nature of my relationship with my grandfather had remained our secret, maintained even after his death. My father approached his usual path to his office, nodding perfunctorily as he passed my desk. "Morning, Ava, coffee black, and get James and Cora for the 9:30 planning meeting for the announcement." "Good morning, Father," I replied, rising from my seat. "Your coffee will be ready in a moment. Before you settle in, there's something important we need to discuss." He paused, a flicker of irritation crossing his face at the deviation from routine. "Whatever it is can wait until after I've reviewed the overnight reports." "Actually, it can't," I said, my tone shifting subtly. There was something in my voice, a new firmness, perhaps, that made him look at me more directly than he had in years. "What's so urgent?" he asked, impatience evident. "It's about the succession plan and the CEO appointment," I said, gathering the folder from beneath the morning correspondence. "There are complications you need to be aware of immediately." This caught his attention, as I knew it would. Anything that might disrupt his carefully orchestrated transition would be considered a threat. "What complications?" he demanded, finally entering his office and setting his briefcase down. I followed him in, closing the door behind me. "Legal complications, ownership complications, succession complications." My father sighed dramatically, sitting in his leather chair. "Ava, if this is some kind of emotional reaction to yesterday's announcement—" "It's not emotional," I interrupted, something I had never done before. "It's factual, and it's going to change everything you've planned." I placed the folder on his desk and opened it, revealing the first document, my grandfather's original succession plan, signed 15 years earlier. "You're familiar with this, of course," I said. "Grandfather's initial succession plan naming. You as CEO with complete control of the company upon his retirement or death." My father glanced at it dismissively. "Yes, and that same mechanism now applies to James. This is standard." "Actually, it doesn't," I replied, turning to the next document, "because this plan was superseded 3 months before grandfather's death." I watched my father's expression change as he looked at the amended succession document, one he had never seen before. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the text, face hardening when he reached the critical section. "This is absurd," he said, voice low and dangerous. "This appears to indicate that Clarence placed significant ownership shares in a separate holding entity. That's not possible. I would have known." "Would you?" I asked simply. "You were focused on maintaining appearances and positioning James as the heir apparent. The actual legal structure of the company didn't interest you as long as your authority wasn't challenged." He began reading more carefully now, his growing alarm evident. "This suggests the holding entity controls nearly 40% of Halcyon." "Who controls this entity? It can't be legal. Where did these shares come from?" "They came from grandfather's personal holdings," I explained. "Shares he never transferred to you because he was concerned about the company's direction. And as for who controls the entity..." I slid the final document across the desk. the ownership certificate of Halcyon Innovation Holdings, LLC. The name at the top read clearly, Ava Halcyon, managing member and sole owner. The silence that followed was profound. My father stared at the document, then at me, his worldview visibly crumbling as the implications became clear. "This is forgery," he finally managed, though his voice lacked conviction. He recognized my grandfather's distinctive signature, the proper legal seals, the meticulous documentation that characterized all of Clarence's important decisions. "It's not forgery," I said calmly. "It's succession planning. Just not the succession you assumed. Grandfather saw what was happening to Halcyon under your leadership. He watched you promote James despite his lack of qualifications. And he made arrangements to protect the company he built." "By giving it to my secretary daughter?" he asked incredulously, anger beginning to replace shock. "By giving it to the granddaughter he had been mentoring since she was 15, I corrected. "The Stanford MBA you dismissed as a secretary. The strategist who has actually been running Halcyon for the past 5 years while you and James took credit for the results." His face flushed. "That's preposterous. You answer phones and schedule meetings." "I rebuilt this company," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Every strategic initiative that turned Halcyon around came from me. Every product innovation, every operational improvement, every client relationship that saved us from bankruptcy. All my work, implemented through a network of competent professionals who deserved better leadership than they were getting." Father stood abruptly, his chair rolling backward. "I won't stand for this. The board won't stand for this. James is the future of this company." "James couldn't explain our core products if his life depended on it," I interrupted. "The board has already seen that. Yesterday, when Walter asked him about the enterprise solution, he couldn't answer even basic questions about the technology that's driving our growth." "Technical details aren't a CEO's concern," my father insisted, though with less certainty. "Leadership is a CEO's concern," I countered. "Understanding the business is a CEO's concern. James has demonstrated neither." I moved to the door, then turned back. "I've scheduled a meeting in the main conference room at 10 a.m. The board has been notified, as have the senior leadership team. I'll be presenting the legal documentation and formally assuming my role as the controlling shareholder of Halcyon Technologies." My father stared at me, struggling to reconcile the daughter he thought he knew with the woman standing before him. "Why?" he finally asked. "Why pretend to be something you weren't? Why hide for 5 years?" The question deserved a genuine answer. "I didn't want it to come to this," I admitted. "I hoped that by improving the company from within, by demonstrating what was possible through results rather than confrontation, you might recognize that leadership isn't defined by gender or birth, order, that you might see James's limitations and reconsider, that I wouldn't have to use grandfather's contingency plan." I paused, the weight of 5 years of dismissed contributions heavy in my voice. "I wanted to earn your respect, not force it through. Legal maneuvering. But yesterday when you said, 'Remember your place, Ava, you're just the secretary,' I realized you would never see me as anything else, no matter what I accomplished." My father's expression shifted between anger, confusion, and something that might have been the first glimmer of understanding. "This meeting is happening," I continued. "You can choose how to respond. You can fight me, embarrass yourself, and damage the company in the process. Or you can accept that grandfather saw something in me that you refuse to see, and find a way forward that preserves both Halcyon's future and your dignity." I opened the door, preparing to leave. "You have until 10-year-old am to decide. I hope you choose wisely." As I walked back to my desk, I felt lighter than I had in years. The secret strength that had sustained me through dismissal and disrespect, my grandfather's faith and my own carefully accumulated power, was no longer secret. Whether they accepted it willingly or fought me to the bitter end, the truth was finally emerging. Halcyon's secretary had always been its savior. Now it was time to claim my rightful place, not as someone's daughter or sister, but as the leader who had earned it through vision, perseverance, and results. The hour between. My confrontation with my father and the scheduled board meeting was the longest of my life. I returned to my desk, outwardly composed while internally processing the seismic shift that had just occurred. 5 years of calculated restraint had finally given way to open declaration. There was no going back. I watched my father's office door remain firmly closed. No sounds emerged, no calls were made, at least none that I could hear. This uncharacteristic silence was more unnerving than any outburst would have been. Edward Halcyon was not a man who processed setbacks quietly. His stillness suggested he was either in profound shock or calculating a counteroffensive. At 9:20, James strode past my desk, heading for our father's office. His usual smug acknowledgement of my presence was absent. He didn't look at me at all. Someone had called him. The battle lines were being drawn. I took a deep breath and allowed myself a moment of pure, unfiltered emotion. The anger I had suppressed for years threatened to surface. Anger at being dismissed despite my qualifications, at watching my brother fail upward while I worked in the shadows, at having to fight for recognition that should have been based on merit rather than gender or birth order. Beneath the anger lay hurt, a child's fundamental pain at parental rejection. Why had my accomplishments never been enough? What would it have taken for my father to see me as worthy of the Halcyon legacy? Had his vision been so clouded by traditional expectations that he couldn't recognize the very qualities my grandfather had valued? And deeper still was fear. Not of losing. The legal documentation was ironclad, and Walter would support its authenticity. What terrified me was winning at the cost of destroying my family entirely. Would there be any path to reconciliation after this? Could my father ever accept my leadership, or would his pride prevent him from ever truly seeing me? These emotions threatened to overwhelm me, but I couldn't afford to indulge them. Not now. The company I loved, the legacy I had fought to preserve, required clear thinking and strategic action. Emotional catharsis would have to wait. At 9:35, Cora emerged from the conference room where she had been meeting with the product team. Her confident stride faltered slightly when she saw me at my desk, apparently still in my secretary role despite whatever James might have told her. She hesitated, then approached. "Ava," she said, her voice carefully modulated. "James just texted that the 9:30 planning meeting is delayed. Do you know anything about that?" I met her gaze steadily. "The meeting has been superseded by a full board and leadership session at 10 a.m. Her perfectly manicured hand tightened around her tablet. "I wasn't informed of any board meeting." "You are now," I replied simply. Something in my tone must have alerted her that the dynamic had shifted. Cora had always been perceptive. It was one of her genuine talents beneath the calculated exterior. "What's happening, Ava?" she asked, dropping the professional veneer momentarily. "There's something going on, isn't there?" For a brief moment, I saw the roommate I had once trusted, the woman with whom I had shared late-night conversations about breaking glass ceilings and changing outdated business cultures. Before ambition and expediency had led her to align with James, we had been friends with shared dreams. "Everything's changing," I said quietly. "You might want to reconsider your alliances before the meeting." Confusion and wariness crossed her face. "What does that mean?" "It means that in 30 minutes, the power structure you've so carefully positioned yourself within will no longer exist. Make your choices accordingly." She stared at me, reassessing everything she thought she knew. Without another word, she turned and walked briskly toward James and my father, who were now visible through the glass walls of the executive office, gesturing intensely as they spoke. I watched the three of them, father, son, and future daughter-in-law, huddled, together in crisis. They had formed their united front against me. Now I needed to prepare for the confrontation that would determine Halcyon's future. At 9:45, I walked to the executive restroom, a small privilege I had allowed myself despite my secretary role. I needed a moment of privacy before the battle. Ahead. The woman in the mirror looked different somehow. Same clothing, same carefully conservative hairstyle, but her eyes held a clarity and purpose that had been partially veiled before. "You're ready for this," I told my reflection. "Grandfather believed in you. More importantly, you've proven yourself through results, not words." I thought about the path that had led to this moment. The afternoons spent in Clarence's office absorbing business wisdom, the nights studying financial models while classmates partied, the careful cultivation of allies who didn't know they were allies, the strategic patience of waiting for the right moment rather than reacting to each slight and dismissal. Most of all, I thought about my grandfather's words during our last private conversation in the hospital. "Ava," he had said, his voice weakened but his eyes sharp as ever. "There are two kinds of power in this world. The kind that's given, which can be taken away just as easily, and the kind that's earned through capability and vision. I've given you the tools to claim your rightful place, but your real power comes from what you've built in yourself. Never forget that." I hadn't forgotten. Even with legal ownership, I would still need to lead effectively, to demonstrate that my grandfather's faith was justified and that my hidden leadership had been the true source of Halcyon's revival. At 9:55, I gathered my documents and walked to the main conference room. Walter was already there, as were several other board members who looked confused about the hastily called meeting. The senior leadership team began filing in, their expressions ranging from curious to concerned. Jacob from product development caught my eye, raising an eyebrow in silent question. I gave him the smallest nod, and he seemed to understand that something momentous was about to happen. At 9:59, my father entered with James and Cora flanking him. His face was a controlled mask of authority, though I could see the tension in his jaw. James looked flushed with anger, while Cora maintained professional composure, despite the uncertainty in her eyes. The room quieted as my father took his customary seat at the head of the table. I remained standing at the opposite end, documents in hand, ready to challenge the hierarchy that had defined my life. "I've called this emergency session," my father began, "to address some confusion regarding our succession planning." And so it began. His attempt to control the narrative, to frame my documentation as a misunderstanding rather than a legitimate claim to leadership. As he spoke, I felt a strange sense of calm descend over me. The emotional storm had passed, leaving clear purpose in its wake. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every talented person at Halcyon who deserved leadership that valued substance over appearance. It was about my grandfather's vision for a company that innovated rather than stagnated. It was about transforming a painful personal struggle into a catalyst for necessary change. As my father finished his opening remarks and all eyes turned to me, I knew that the time for hiding was over. The secretary was about to reveal herself as the rightful leader, and nothing at Halcyon would ever be the same. "Thank you for joining this meeting on short notice," I began, my voice steady and assured. Not the deferential tone of a secretary, but the confident delivery of an executive. "I appreciate everyone's flexibility as we address a matter of critical importance to Halcyon's future." The room's attention shifted palpably. Several board members exchanged glances, clearly surprised by my authoritative tone. The senior leadership team sat straighter, sensing the unusual dynamics at play. My father's expression darkened as he realized I was taking control of the meeting he had attempted to commandeer. "Ava," he interjected, "perhaps you should distribute the materials and take notes while we discuss." "That won't be necessary," I replied smoothly, meeting his gaze directly. "I'll be leading this portion of the meeting." Without waiting for his response, I activated the conference room display and projected the first document, the current ownership structure of Halcyon Technologies as officially registered with the SEC. As you can see, I continued, the ownership of Halcyon has been misrepresented in recent discussions about succession planning. While Edward Halcyon controls 30% of shares and James Halcyon holds 15%, what hasn't been disclosed is the existence of Halcyon Innovation Holdings, which controls 40% of the company. Murmurs spread through the room. Walter Hargrove nodded slightly, while most board members looked genuinely surprised. My father's jaw tightened as he realized I was laying out my case methodically rather than making an emotional appeal. "Who controls this holding company?" asked Richard Tanner, our longest-serving board member after Walter. I switched to the next document, the LLC registration clearly showing my name as the sole managing member. "I do," I stated simply. "By extension, I am the largest shareholder of Halcyon Technologies and have been for the past 5 years." The room erupted in confused conversation. James stood abruptly, his face flushed. "This is ridiculous," he exclaimed. "Some kind of forgery or manipulation? My sister has always been jealous of—" "The documentation is genuine," Walter interrupted, his authoritative voice cutting through the chaos. "I witnessed its execution by Clarence Halcyon 3 months before his death. He created this structure deliberately and with full legal counsel." All eyes turned to Walter, whose reputation for integrity was unimpeachable. As my grandfather's oldest friend and business partner, his confirmation carried immense weight. "Why would Clarence do this without informing the board?" asked another member, visibly disturbed by the revelation. I advanced to the next slide, a letter written by my grandfather, addressed to the board but never delivered. I had debated whether to share this deeply personal document, but ultimately decided that transparency was necessary. "My grandfather prepared this letter explaining his decision," I said. "With your permission, I'll read the relevant portion." No one objected, though my father looked as if he might. I began reading. "To the Board of Directors of Halcyon Technologies, 4B. You are reading this. Then circumstances have required Ava to assert her rightful position within the company. I had hoped this would not be necessary, that merit and results would speak for themselves. But I have lived long enough to know that tradition and bias often overrule evidence and capability. For the past 15 years, I have been privately mentoring Ava in all aspects of business leadership. Her understanding of technology, markets, and organizational dynamics exceeds that of many executives with decades more experience. Her strategic vision for Halcyon's future aligns with my own while incorporating fresh perspectives our company desperately needs. I have watched with disappointment as Edward has consistently overlooked her contributions while promoting James, despite his limited capabilities. This pattern threatens the company's future and disrespects the meritocratic principles upon which Halcyon was founded. Therefore, I have transferred controlling interest to Ava through Halcyon Innovation Holdings. This decision was not made lightly, but with absolute conviction that she represents the best hope for the company's continued success. I ask the board to support this transition and to evaluate Ava's leadership based on results rather than preconceptions. Halcyon has always thrived by embracing change rather than resisting it. This is no exception. The silence that followed was profound. My father stared at the screen, seeing his own father's words condemning his leadership decisions. James had sunk back into his chair, the reality of his situation finally penetrating his sense of entitlement. I continued my presentation, shifting from legal authority to demonstrated results. I displayed performance metrics for the various initiatives I had implemented over the past 5 years. Initiatives previously attributed to others, but now clearly linked to my direction through detailed documentation. The enterprise solution that has driven 40% of our recent growth? I designed the product roadmap and feature set, working directly with Jacob Chen's team. Jacob nodded in confirmation, finally understanding why his most successful projects had always seemed to receive mysterious support despite official channels blocking them. Our client retention program that reversed our churn rate? I developed and implemented it through Amelia's client success team. Amelia's eyes widened with recognition, connecting the dots of how her department had been subtly guided toward effective strategies that seemed to emerge from nowhere. The operational efficiency improvements that reduced costs by 22% while improving quality metrics? I restructured those systems personally, working through various team members who implemented specific components. With each revelation, I could see the senior leadership team's perception shifting. What had seemed like disconnected successes were now revealed as part of a cohesive strategy. My strategy, executed from behind the scenes while I maintained the appearance of a secretary. For 5 years, I concluded, I have effectively led this company while allowing others to take credit for the results. I did this not from lack of confidence or capability, but from a genuine hope that the company could succeed without the disruption of challenging existing power structures. Yesterday made it clear that this approach is no longer sustainable. I turned to face my father directly. When you said, "Remember your place, Ava. You're just the secretary," you confirmed what I had long suspected, that no amount of success would change your perception. No contribution would be recognized as long as it came from me rather than James. My father's expression was unreadable, a complex mixture of anger, shock, and perhaps, though it might have been wishful thinking, the first glimmer of recognition that he had profoundly misjudged his daughter. Cora, ever the strategic thinker, had remained silent throughout my presentation, carefully assessing the shifting power dynamics. Now she spoke, her tone measured. "This is certainly unexpected," she said carefully. "But assuming the legal documentation is valid, what exactly are you proposing, Ava?" It was a good question, pragmatic and forward-looking. Despite our complicated history, I had always respected Cora's intelligence. "I'm not proposing anything," I replied. "I'm stating facts. As controlling shareholder, I am exercising my right to appoint Halcyon's CEO. Effective immediately, I will assume that role." I looked around the room, meeting each person's gaze directly. This isn't a hostile takeover, it's a correction. Halcyon will continue to thrive, but under leadership that understands both its history and its future potential. I welcome those who share that vision to remain part of our team, regardless of past alignments. My eyes finally settled on my father and brother. Family relationships and business roles are separate considerations. I hope we can find a path forward that honors both. But the company's welfare must take priority over personal feelings or traditional expectations. The strategic assembly was complete. I had presented my case not through emotional appeals, but through documentation, witnesses, and demonstrable results. The foundation I had carefully built over 5 years, legal, operational, and relational, now stood revealed in its full strength. What remained was to see how my opposition would respond to this fundamental shift in their understanding of both Halcyon Technologies and the woman they had dismissed as just the secretary. The aftermath of my presentation created a boardroom atmosphere unlike anything Halcyon had ever experienced. The immaculate space with its polished table and ergonomic chairs had transformed into something else entirely. A battlefield where decades of assumptions and power structures were being challenged in real time. The initial shock was giving way to a kaleidoscope of reactions. Some board members were reviewing the documents I had distributed, scrutinizing the legal language with newfound intensity. Others were whispering among themselves, forming impromptu alliances or recalculating their positions. The senior leadership team seemed caught between concern for their own futures and a dawning recognition of why the company had actually improved over the past 5 years. My father broke the tense silence first, his voice controlled but with an undercurrent of fury I recognized from childhood disagreements. "This is unprecedented," he said, attempting to reclaim control of the meeting. Regardless of these documents, there are protocols for leadership transitions. The board must have time to review, to consider all implications. The board has no authority to overrule share ownership, Walter interjected firmly. As Clarence's written succession plan makes clear, this transfer of control was legally executed and properly documented. The only question is how we implement this transition. Richard. Tanner, always the pragmatist, leaned forward. I'd like to hear from legal counsel on this matter. Of course, I agreed immediately. Patricia Winters from corporate counsel is on her way. I've provided her with the documentation in advance so she can offer an informed opinion. James slammed his hand on the table, his face contorted with the entitled rage of someone unaccustomed to not getting his way. This is absurd. You've been planning this coup for years. Manipulating grandfather when he was ill, creating a paper trail to steal what isn't yours. That's enough, James, Walter said sharply. Clarence was of sound mind and had discussed these concerns with me for years before formalizing them. Your accusations dishonor his memory and judgment. Cora placed a restraining hand on James's arm, her strategic mind clearly processing faster than his emotional reactions. Perhaps we should all take a step back and consider what's best for Halcyon, she suggested, her voice measured. If these ownership documents are valid, fighting them could create instability that would damage the company. I recognized her pivot immediately, already positioning herself for whatever new reality was emerging. Cora had always been adaptable, which made her both a valuable ally and a dangerous opponent. The boardroom door opened, and Patricia Winters entered with her characteristic efficiency. Our head of legal affairs for the past decade, Patricia had been one of my quiet allies, though she hadn't known the full extent of my grandfather's planning. Ms. Winters, my father acknowledged, straightening slightly. We need your assessment of some documentation that has been presented regarding company ownership and control. Patricia glanced briefly at me before addressing the room. I've reviewed the materials Ms. Halcyon provided this morning and compared them with our corporate records. The documentation appears completely valid and properly executed. Halcyon. Innovation Holdings does indeed control 40% of company shares, and Ms. Ava Halcyon is the sole managing member of that entity. My father's face tightened. And this wasn't brought to my attention as chairman? The registration of the holding company was properly filed with the SEC 5 years ago, Patricia replied evenly. While not specifically highlighted in board presentations, it has been part of our shareholder documentation in every annual report. The implication was clear. My father and the board had been so confident in their control that they hadn't bothered to read the detailed ownership disclosures in their own company's reports. My invisibility had been reinforced by their assumption that I couldn't possibly matter enough to notice. James looked to our father in growing panic. This can't be legal. There must be some way to challenge. There isn't, Patricia stated flatly. Not without protracted litigation that would almost certainly fail and would definitely damage the company in the process. The atmosphere shifted again as the reality settled in. This wasn't a negotiation or an emotional appeal. It was a fate, accompli backed by ironclad legal documentation and the explicit wishes of Halcyon's founder. My father's expression changed, anger giving way to something more calculated. He had always been a strategic thinker when his position was threatened. Even if the ownership structure is as presented, he said carefully, there's the matter of experience and continuity. The transition of a CEO requires careful planning, knowledge transfer. I couldn't help the small, involuntary laugh that escaped me. The irony was too perfect. Knowledge transfer? I echoed. What knowledge would you need to transfer that I don't already possess? I've been effectively running this company for 5 years. Every major initiative, every strategic pivot, every successful product launch came from me, implemented through others, but designed and directed by me. I gestured toward the senior leadership team. Ask Jacob who really designed the architecture for our enterprise solution. Ask Amelia, whose client retention strategy reversed our churn rate. Ask Piper, who restructured our financial reporting to identify hidden growth opportunities. One by one, the team members I named nodded slowly, connections forming as they realized the source of the executive guidance that had seemed so mysteriously effective compared to the official directives they usually received. Is this true? My father asked Jacob directly, his voice betraying rare uncertainty. Jacob glanced at me, then back to my father. The architectural framework that saved the enterprise division came from Ava, he confirmed. We were told it was approved through executive channels, but the actual direction always came through her. And it was brilliant. None of us could figure out why leadership suddenly understood technical needs so perfectly. Similar confirmations came from others, each revelation further cementing the truth. I hadn't just owned Halcyon on paper, I had been its de facto leader while remaining in the shadows. Patricia Winters cleared her throat. From a legal perspective, the path forward is clear. Ms. Ava Halcyon, as controlling shareholder, has the authority to appoint the CEO and make leadership changes as she sees fit. The board's role is advisory in this context, not authoritative. The battlefield was now fully defined. The legal terrain favored me completely. The operational landscape, the actual functioning of the company, had been under my control for years. The relational territory was shifting as people realized where competence truly resided. My father stood slowly, his imposing presence diminished by the revelations, but not extinguished. I request a brief recess to consult privately with James and our personal counsel. Of course, I agreed. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. As they departed, the remaining board members and executives shifted uncomfortably, unsure of protocol in this unprecedented situation. I remained standing at the head of the table, the position I had earned but never claimed until now. I understand. This is unexpected, I acknowledged to the room. But I want to be clear. This isn't about personal grievances or family drama. It's about ensuring Halcyon continues to thrive with leadership that understands both its history and its future potential. Walter nodded approvingly. Several others seemed to relax slightly, responding to the calm confidence I projected. The battlefield was set. The first skirmish had gone decisively in my favor. Now I needed to prepare for the counterattack that would inevitably come when my father and brother returned, men who had never accepted defeat gracefully and who would not surrender their perceived birthright without one final desperate stand. The 30-minute recess stretched to 45 as my father, James, and their hastily summoned personal attorney sequestered themselves in my father's office. Through the glass walls, I could see animated discussions, papers being reviewed, and occasional glances in my direction. They were searching for any weakness in my position, any counter-argument that might preserve the power structure they had taken for granted. Meanwhile, the boardroom had transformed into an impromptu strategy session. Board members clustered in small groups, reassessing alliances and calculating implications. The senior leadership team remained seated, processing the revelation that the secretary they had largely ignored had actually been directing their most successful initiatives. Walter approached me, speaking quietly. Clarence would be proud, not just of the outcome, but of how you've handled yourself. Dignity over dramatics. Thank you, I replied, genuinely moved by his words. I wish he could have seen this. He did see it, Walter said with a small smile. He saw it in you long before today. That's why he made the arrangements he did. Our conversation was interrupted as Cora approached, having detached herself from James's orbit to assess her own position independently. Ava, she began, her tone carefully calibrated between respect and caution. Regardless of how this resolves, I want you to know that my acceptance of the COO position wasn't personal. It was a strategic career move. I studied her face, the former friend who had aligned herself with my brother not from affection, but from calculation. I understand strategy, Cora. Perhaps better than you realized. She nodded, acknowledging the point. What happens now? With the company? And with my position? That depends partly on what happens when they return, I answered honestly. But, ultimately, I'll be making decisions based on merit and contribution, not personal history. Anyone who genuinely adds value to Halcyon will have a place. Her relief was visible, but tempered with newfound wariness. Cora was realizing what others were just beginning to understand, that beneath my quiet exterior lay a strategic mind that had outmaneuvered everyone for years. At precisely 50 minutes after the recess began, my father returned with James and their attorney. Their expressions told the story before they spoke, the tight, resigned look of men who had exhausted their options and found no viable path forward. As everyone resumed their seats, I noticed a shift in the room's energy. The uncertainty that had permeated the space earlier had crystallized into anticipation. The power was visibly transferring, not just legally through documentation, but psychologically in how people position themselves, in their body language, in the direction of their attention. My father took his customary seat at the head of the table, a final assertion of the authority he had wielded for decades. I remained standing at the opposite end, making no move to challenge this symbolic positioning. The real power had already shifted. Contesting seating arrangements would be petty. After consultation with counsel, my father began, his voice carefully controlled. We acknowledge the legal validity of the ownership structure presented by Ava. While the method of its revelation is unconventional, the documentation appears to be in order. This grudging acknowledgement was as close to acceptance as I could expect. I nodded slightly, recognizing both the concession and the implied criticism. However, he continued, his businessman instincts emerging, abrupt leadership changes create unnecessary disruption and potential market uncertainty. I propose a transition period of 6 months, during which James and I will work closely with Ava to ensure continuity and proper knowledge transfer. It was a transparent attempt to maintain control while searching for ways to undermine my position. 6 months would give them time to approach other shareholders, create alliances against me, or find legal technicalities they could exploit. That won't be necessary, I replied calmly. As I've demonstrated, I've been effectively running Halcyon's operations for 5 years. There's no knowledge to transfer that I don't already possess. James leaned forward, unable to contain himself despite their obviously planned approach. You've been manipulating from the shadows, not leading. Leadership requires visibility, accountability, which I'm now assuming fully, I interjected. My preference for efficacy over ego doesn't diminish my leadership. It defines it. My father raised a hand to silence James, recognizing the weakness of his emotional arguments. The board should have input on such a significant transition. He tried instead looking to the directors for support. Walter spoke before I needed to. The board serves at the pleasure of the shareholders, Edward. That's Corporate Governance 101. If Ava controls 40% of shares directly and you and James collectively control 45%, the remaining 15% held by minor shareholders and the employee ownership plan isn't enough to overrule her position, especially since I and several others will be voting our portions with Ava. The room absorbed this statement, understanding its implications. Even if my father and brother united against me with their 45%, they couldn't assemble a majority coalition. The mathematical reality was undeniable. My father's jaw tightened as he recognized the finality of his position. And what role do you envision for me and James in this new structure? He asked, voice ice cold. This was the turning point, the moment where I could choose retribution or reconciliation, punishment, or pragmatism. That depends on what you can contribute, I said carefully. This isn't about personal vendettas. It's about having the right people in the right positions to move Halcyon forward. I looked directly at James. Your skills in relationship building and public representation have value when properly directed. But they don't qualify you for CEO. If you're willing to work within a more appropriate role that matches your actual capabilities, there can be a place for you. His face flushed with humiliation and rage, but before he could respond, I turned to my father. As for you, Father, your experience and historical knowledge remain valuable, though your approach to leadership has become outdated. The chairman. Emeritus position would allow you to maintain your external relationships and board presence while transitioning operational control. The offer was genuine but conditional, a path to preserve dignity without retaining power. My father recognized it for what it was, the best terms he would get under the circumstances. Patricia Winters, ever the procedural expert, spoke up. If these arrangements are agreeable, we should formalize them through proper documentation and board resolution. I'll need time to consider, my father replied stiffly. Of course, I acknowledged. However, the leadership transition itself is effective immediately. I'll be meeting with the senior team this afternoon to outline initial priorities and organizational changes. With those words, the power reversal became concrete. I wasn't asking permission or seeking approval. I was informing them of decisions already made, authority already assumed. James stood abruptly, unable to contain his anger any longer. This is ridiculous. You can't just walk in and take over. You're not qualified. You're not prepared. James, I interrupted quietly. I built the success you've been taking credit for. Every achievement you've claimed in the past 5 years was my work. I'm not taking over. I'm simply stepping out of the shadows. The room fell silent, the truth of my words hanging in the air. Jacob and Amelia exchanged knowing glances, pieces, finally fitting together in their understanding of how Halcyon had actually functioned. My father stood slowly, gathering his dignity around him like armor. This meeting is clearly over. We'll communicate our decision regarding your offers after appropriate consideration. As they moved to leave, Walter spoke once more. Clarence always said that Halcyon's greatest strength was its ability to adapt when necessary. Perhaps it's time for the Halcyon family to demonstrate the same quality. My father paused at the door, something unreadable crossing his face. For a moment, I thought he might say something conciliatory. Instead, he simply nodded curtly and departed, James following in his wake. In their absence, the atmosphere in the room transformed. The tension of confrontation gave way to the energy of new beginnings. Board members who had been cautiously silent now approached with congratulations and assurances of support. Senior leaders began discussing long-dormant ideas they felt might finally have a chance to flourish. I had arrived at the battlefield as a secretary and emerged as CEO. The power had reversed completely, founded not just on legal documentation, but on demonstrated capability and vision. The war wasn't fully won. My father and brother would not accept defeat easily, but the most critical battle had ended decisively in my favor. For the first time in 5 years, I didn't need to hide my competence or diminish my vision. I was finally standing in the light, ready to lead Halcyon openly into its next chapter. The hours following the boardroom confrontation unfolded with surprising speed. News travels fast in any organization, but in one experiencing a seismic leadership shift, it moves at lightning pace. By lunchtime, every employee at Halcyon Technologies knew something monumental had happened, though the details varied wildly depending on who was sharing them. I decided to address the situation directly rather than allowing rumors to flourish. At 2:00 p.m., I called an all-hands meeting in our largest conference space, standing before the assembled employees not as the secretary they had known, but as the CEO I had secretly been. I know many of you have heard conflicting information about changes in leadership, I began, scanning the faces before me, curious, concerned, confused. I want to provide clarity directly. Effective immediately, I am assuming the role of chief. executive officer of Halcyon Technologies. The murmurs that spread through the room reflected collective surprise. For years, these people had passed me in hallways with polite nods at best, complete disregard at worst. Now I stood before them as their leader. Some of you may be wondering how the company secretary came to be CEO. I continued with a small smile. The truth is more complex than you might imagine. For the past 5 years, I have been working behind the scenes, guiding many of our most successful initiatives while allowing others to take visible credit. As I explained the reality of my role in Halcyon's transformation, I could see the dawning recognition in many faces, particularly those who had implemented my strategies without knowing their true source. This transition may seem sudden, but I want to assure you that Halcyon's operations and direction will continue with the same focus on innovation and excellence that has driven our recent success. The difference is that now, the leadership structure will align with the actual sources of that success. After addressing immediate concerns about job security and organizational stability, I ended the meeting with a commitment to transparency moving forward. As employees filed out, many approached with congratulations or questions, seeing me with new eyes and reconsidering countless interactions from the past. Meanwhile, the collapse of my opposition was unfolding in ways both public and private. James's reaction was the most immediate and visible. By 3 p.m., he had cleared out his office in a chaotic whirlwind of activity, instructing his assistant to pack his awards and personal items while he made angry phone calls in the hallway, loud enough for others to hear. "It's a hostile takeover, effectively," he told someone, pacing outside the executive suite. "She manipulated our grandfather, created some kind of shadow operation. Yes, legally it seems airtight, but ethically, it's outrageous. His performance wasn't for my benefit. He didn't realize I was within earshot, reviewing transition details with Patricia in a nearby conference room. It was a display meant for the witnesses he assumed would sympathize with his plight. But the audience was no longer receptive to his narrative. Too many people had already begun connecting dots, realizing that the company's actual success had little to do with James's leadership. By 4:30 p.m., he made his final exit, walking through the office with deliberate confidence that didn't match his flushed face and clenched jaw. He didn't say goodbye to anyone, didn't acknowledge the team members who had supported him for years. His departure was the physical manifestation of his inability to accept reality, dramatic, self-centered, and ultimately insignificant to the YI company's operations. My father's response was more strategic but equally revealing of his character. He didn't clear out his office or make a public display. Instead, he called an impromptu meeting with several long-standing board members at his private club across town, attempting to build a coalition that could limit my authority, even if they couldn't remove me. I learned of this meeting not through corporate espionage, but through Walter, who had been invited and attended specifically to monitor the situation. It was a last-ditch effort to salvage some control, Walter told me when he called that evening. Edward proposed creating an executive committee with oversight powers that could effectively check your decisions. "And the response?" I asked, though I could guess from Walter's tone. "Lukewarm at best." Richard and Michael were diplomatic but non-committal. The others seemed uncomfortable with the entire approach. Walter paused before adding, "Edward doesn't realize how much his stock has fallen. The board has watched Halcyon thrive in recent years while questioning his actual contribution. Now that the truth is emerging, they're reassessing everything." "And Cora?" I asked, curious about my former friend's positioning. "The most interesting development," Walter said with a hint of admiration. "She arrived with Edward but distanced herself throughout the meeting, made a point of mentioning specific initiatives she had supported, all ones you apparently orchestrated, and emphasized her focus on operational excellence regardless of leadership structure." I couldn't help but smile at Cora's adaptability. She had already begun repositioning herself for the new reality, separating from James and my father, while highlighting her potential value to the company moving forward. By the next morning, the collapse of my opposition was nearly complete. James had already updated his LinkedIn profile, describing himself as former executive seeking new opportunities, with a carefully worded narrative that implied he had chosen to leave rather than been displaced. Several industry contacts forwarded me his emails seeking meetings, all containing versions of the same story about wanting new challenges beyond the family business. My father took a different approach. At 9 a.m. sharp, his assistant, not me for the first time in 5 years, requested a meeting in his office. I agreed, curious about what strategy he would attempt next. When I entered, I found him sitting behind his desk, posture perfect, expression controlled. The office looked exactly as it had yesterday, with one notable difference. The photographs of my grandfather had been removed from the credenza behind him. "I've considered your proposal," he said without preamble. "I find the terms unacceptable." I nodded, having anticipated this response. "What would you suggest instead?" "I'll accept a full retirement with appropriate compensation," he stated. "No emeritus position, no ongoing role, a clean break." This surprised me. I had expected him to fight for continued influence, not to remove himself entirely. "May I ask why?" I inquired, genuinely curious about his reasoning. Something flashed across his face, pride perhaps, or wounded dignity. "I built this company after your grandfather. I won't remain in a diminished capacity, taking direction from—" He stopped himself. "From your daughter?" I finished for him. "From someone who obtained control through methods I find questionable," he amended carefully. I considered his position, recognizing the pride that prevented him from adapting to new circumstances. My father had always defined himself through authority and control. Without them, he would rather remove himself entirely than accept a new role. "I'll have Patricia draft the retirement agreement," I said simply. "The board will want to recognize your years of service appropriately." He nodded curtly. Our business concluded. As I turned to leave, he spoke once more. "Why the secrecy, Ava? Why pretend to be something you weren't for 5 years? If you had this capability, this vision, you claim, why hide it?" I paused at the door, weighing how much to reveal. "I didn't want it to come to this," I admitted. "I hoped that results would speak for themselves, that performance would matter more than preconceptions. I wanted to earn recognition based on merit, not force it through confrontation." "And when did you decide that wasn't possible?" he asked, something almost vulnerable in his question. "When you said, 'Remember your place, Ava. You're just the secretary.' After 5 years of rebuilding the company you and James were running into the ground, you still couldn't see me as anything but a secretary. That's when I knew no achievement would ever be enough to change your perception." He had no response to this truth, and I left him sitting alone in his office, a man whose worldview had collapsed alongside his authority, unable to reconcile his lifetime of assumptions with the reality his daughter had created. By the end of the day, both James and my father had cleared out their offices. The antagonists who had dismissed and underestimated me for years had departed not with a strategic counterattack, but with the disorganized retreat of those who discovered too late that the battle was already lost. The collapse was complete, leaving me with both the victory I had earned and the complexities of rebuilding relationships that might never fully heal. My first official week as CEO of Halcyon Technologies unfolded with a mixture of exhilaration and sobering responsibility. The power I had wielded from the shadows for 5 years was now mine to exercise openly, bringing both freedom and accountability I hadn't fully anticipated. My first priority was stabilizing the organization after the shock of the leadership change. I scheduled individual meetings with each department head, starting with those whose support would be most critical. Jacob Chen from Product Development was my first appointment on Monday morning. As he entered my new office, the same space my father had occupied but already transformed with cleaner lines and better lighting, I could see him recalibrating his perception of me in real time. "I've been thinking about our conversations over the past few years," he said after we'd settled. "And all those times you passed along ideas or routed feedback that seemed to come from nowhere. That was all you, wasn't it?" I nodded. "Most of it, yes. I found that suggestions were more likely to be implemented if people didn't know they came from just the secretary." He shook his head, impressed and a little embarrassed. "The integration architecture for the enterprise platform, the one that saved the entire division, I presented that as my own work to the executive team. And you should have received credit for it," I assured him. "You executed it brilliantly and improved on several aspects of the original design." "But it wasn't my idea," he insisted. "I've been taking credit for your work." "Jacob," I said firmly, "Halcyon isn't about individual credit or ego. It's about creating technology that solves real problems. You did that regardless of where the initial concept originated. I don't want people walking on eggshells, worried about who deserves recognition. I want us focused on results." This approach, emphasizing collective achievement over personal credit, became the foundation of the new organizational culture I began establishing. In each meeting with department heads, I made clear that the past was prologue. What mattered now was how we moved forward together. Amelia Rhodes from Client Success had perhaps the most illuminating reaction when we met. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I always wondered why James and your father never seemed interested in the client feedback data I compiled. I'd send reports directly to them, but the only meaningful responses came through you." They viewed client relationships as social opportunities rather than strategic assets, I explained. Dinners and golf outings rather than solving business problems. She leaned forward, energized by finally having a leader who understood her department's value. "I have 3 years of pattern data showing exactly what our enterprise clients need next. I've been sitting on it because previous leadership wasn't interested. Would you like to see it?" "Absolutely. That's exactly the kind of insight we need to drive our product roadmap." These conversations repeated across departments. Talented professionals who had been constrained by old leadership suddenly finding their expertise valued and their insights welcomed. The collective energy was palpable as people realized they could finally work openly with a CEO who understood both the technology and the business. My meeting with Cora Matthews, however, presented unique challenges. Her strategic pivot away from James and my father had been swift and self-preserving, but her position remained ambiguous. As the newly appointed COO with little organizational history at Halcyon, she existed in a professional limbo. She arrived precisely on time, dressed impeccably as always, her expression carefully neutral as she took a seat across from me. "I imagine you're reconsidering my role," she began pragmatically, never one to avoid difficult conversations. "I'm reconsidering everyone's role," I replied, "including my own. The question is, where you best fit in the Halcyon I'm building." "And where is that?" she asked directly. I studied her, the former friend whose ambition had led her to align with my brother despite knowing his limitations. Her talent was undeniable, her business acumen sharp. The question wasn't capability, but trust. "That depends," I said. "Are you here because you believe in what Halcyon can become, or because it was the most advantageous career move at the time?" Her smile was slight but genuine. "Both, obviously. I've always been transparent about my ambition." "Yes, you have," I acknowledged, "and I respect that more than false modesty or pretended loyalty." "So where does that leave us?" she asked. "I need a COO who understands operations and can execute efficiently," I stated. "Someone who complements my strategic focus with tactical excellence. Your experience at Vertex demonstrated those capabilities." "But," she prompted, sensing the unspoken reservation, "but I need to know you're committed to Halcyon's success." not just your own advancement. The two should align, but when they conflict, I need to trust your priorities. Cora considered this, then nodded slowly. Fair enough. I propose a 6-month trial period. Judge me by results and demonstrated loyalty, not promises or past affiliations. Her directness was refreshing, and her proposal practical. Agreed. 6 months, with clear performance metrics and expectations on both sides. As she stood to leave, she hesitated. For what it's worth, Ava, what you did these past 5 years, rebuilding the company from within while being dismissed as just the secretary. It's extraordinary. I'm not sure I would have had the patience. It wasn't patience, I corrected her. It was strategy. Sometimes the longest path is the most effective one. With the senior leadership team stabilized, I turned my attention to the broader organizational structure. The old Halcyon had been hierarchical, bureaucratic, and resistant to change. The new Halcyon would be flatter, more agile, and innovation-focused. Eliminated 3 layers of middle management that had served primarily as information gatekeepers. I created cross-functional teams aligned around client needs rather than internal reporting structures. I implemented a direct feedback system that allowed ideas to flow upward without being filtered through political considerations. The most significant change, however, was establishing the Innovation Council, a rotating group composed of members from every level and department, given resources and authority to pursue promising ideas regardless of source. This institutionalized what I had done informally for years, identifying valuable concepts and creating paths for implementation outside traditional channels. By Friday afternoon, the transformation was well underway. Employees who had been constrained by old structures were embracing new freedoms. Teams that had worked in isolated silos were collaborating across boundaries. The energy in the building was electric, the unmistakable buzz of people who finally felt empowered to do their best work. That evening, I sat alone in my office, reviewing the week's progress and planning next steps. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. It was Walter, stopping by before heading home. "Quite a week," he observed, settling into the chair across from me. "Just the beginning," I replied, sliding a folder across to him. "I'd like your thoughts on this restructuring of our R&D investment strategy." He glanced through it, nodding appreciatively. Very much in line with what Clarence would have wanted, balanced between short-term needs and long-term vision. He closed the folder and looked at me thoughtfully. "He would be proud, you know. Not just of what you've accomplished, but how you've done it." "I hope so," I said quietly. "Any word from Edward or James?" he asked. "Father's retirement agreement is being finalized. James has been approaching our competitors, apparently positioning himself as having insider knowledge of our operations." Walter shook his head. "Predictable, but disappointing." "Patricia is handling it," I assured him. A gentle reminder about his non-disclosure obligations seems to have cooled those conversations. As Walter left, I moved to the window overlooking the city lights beginning to twinkle in the early evening. The new order at Halcyon was taking shape, not as a rejection of its history, but as an evolution of its founding principles. My grandfather had built this company to solve problems through technology innovation. My father had maintained it as a source of status and traditional success. Now it was my turn to lead it into a future that honored its origins while embracing new possibilities. The secretary who had been dismissed and underestimated was now defining the rules of engagement, setting the priorities, and establishing the culture. The new order wasn't about revenge or even vindication. It was about finally allowing Halcyon to become what it was always meant to be. A company where merit outweighed tradition, innovation trumped comfort, and results mattered more than appearances. The transition was far from complete, but the foundation was firmly in place. Halcyon was mine now, not just in legal ownership, but in operational reality and organizational culture. The challenge ahead was proving that my vision deserved the opportunity my grandfather had ensured I would have. 2 weeks into my official leadership, a new challenge emerged from an unexpected direction. I was reviewing quarterly projections. With Piper, when my assistant, the irony of now having my own assistant wasn't lost on me, interrupted with an urgent message. Ms. Halcyon, the Wall Street Journal, is requesting a comment on a story they're running tomorrow. They say it's regarding governance concerns at Halcyon Technologies following the controversial leadership change. I thanked her and excused myself from the meeting. In my office, I found the reporter's email with his direct questions. Was it true that Clarence Halcyon had been suffering from cognitive decline when he transferred controlling interest to me? Had the board been deliberately kept in the dark about ownership changes? Were shareholders considering legal action over the secretive restructuring of the company? The source of these allegations wasn't mentioned, but it wasn't difficult to guess. This had James written all over it, the kind of underhanded attack that avoided direct confrontation while attempting to undermine confidence in my leadership. I forwarded the email to Patricia Winters and our PR director, then called. "Walter, I expected something like this," he said after I explained the situation. "Though I'm disappointed they've chosen to question Clarence's mental capacity. That crosses a line. Do we have documentation of grandfather's cognitive state during that period?" I asked. "Better than that," Walter replied. "We have video." Clarence insisted on recording the signing of all major documents in his final year, specifically to prevent these kinds of challenges. He was quite clear about his reasoning and intentions. This was news to me. Where are these recordings now? In the corporate archives. I'll have them sent to Patricia immediately. The escalation had begun, but I was more prepared than my opposition realized. While they were attacking through insinuation and anonymous sources, I had facts, documentation, and witnesses. Within an hour, I convened a response team consisting of Patricia, our PR director, Walter, and 2 board members with strong media relationships. By evening, we had crafted a comprehensive strategy. Patricia provided the journal with medical documentation of my grandfather's cognitive health, signed by 3 separate specialists who had evaluated him specifically to prevent future challenges. Walter offered to be interviewed on the record about Clarence's decision-making process and explicit intentions. We prepared a statement addressing each allegation directly, supported by documentary evidence including board minutes showing regular updates on the company's ownership structure, subtle references that had been overlooked but were legally sufficient. Most powerfully, we provided selected clips from the video recordings Walter had mentioned, showing my grandfather articulating his concerns about the company's direction and his confidence in my abilities. The journal's story changed significantly overnight, transforming from a potential exposé into a more nuanced piece about family, business succession challenges. The reporter, presented with overwhelming evidence contradicting his original angle, had little choice but to reframe the narrative. But James wasn't finished. 3 days later, a new attack emerged through a different channel. An industry blog published an insider account, claiming that Halcyon's recent successes had been exaggerated through creative accounting and that the company faced significant, undisclosed technical challenges. Again, no named sources, but the details pointed to information only James would have had access to, though significantly distorted. This required a different approach. Rather than responding directly to the allegations, which would only generate more attention for the blog post, I decided to demonstrate our actual technical capabilities and financial stability through action rather than words. I accelerated. The announcement of our new enterprise security platform, a major innovation that had been in development for months and was nearly ready for market. The timing hadn't been ideal, but circumstances demanded a show of strength. The product launch was scheduled for the following week, with invitations to major clients, industry analysts, and media. Rather than the typical executive presentation, I structured the event around actual technical demonstrations led by our development team, with Jacob Chen prominently featured as the project lead. The morning of the launch, however, brought a new complication. One of our largest clients called in a panic, having received an anonymous email warning them about critical security vulnerabilities in our existing platforms, allegedly from a concerned former executive. This crossed the line from annoying to potentially damaging. I immediately assembled our security team to conduct a comprehensive review, not because I believed the claims, but because client confidence was paramount. By midday, they confirmed what I already knew. Our security protocols were solid, with no evidence of the vulnerabilities described in the email. Rather than hiding this incident, I addressed it head-on at the beginning of the launch event. Some of you may have received concerning information about our platforms this morning, I acknowledged to the assembled clients and media. I want to address this transparently. Yes, a former executive has been making unfounded claims about our technology. No, these claims have no basis in fact, as our security audit today confirmed. I paused, making eye contact with key clients. But I understand that in today's environment, trust must be earned continuously. That's why we're taking an unprecedented step today. I gestured to our chief security officer who joined me on stage. We're announcing the Halcyon Security Transparency Initiative. Beginning next month, we will undergo quarterly third-party security audits, with results shared directly with our clients. Additionally, we're establishing a bug bounty program with significant rewards for identifying legitimate vulnerabilities. The room's energy shifted perceptibly. What had begun as a defensive position against James's attacks had transformed into an industry-leading commitment to transparency that positioned Halcyon at the forefront of security accountability. The product demonstration that followed was flawless, with Jacob and his team showcasing innovations that clearly demonstrated our technical leadership. By the end of the event, the earlier concerns had been replaced by genuine enthusiasm for both our technology and our approach to client partnership. As attendees mingled afterward, I overheard one CIO tell another, "This is night and day compared to the previous regime. Remember those product launches that were all buzzwords and no substance? This team actually understands what they've built." That evening, I received an unexpected call from Amelia in client success. "I thought you should—" "No," she said. 3 clients who received those warning emails called today to increase their contracts. They said the way we handled the situation gave them more confidence in Halcyon than they've ever had. James's attempted sabotage had backfired completely, strengthening our client relationships rather than damaging them. But I knew he wouldn't stop there. His attacks would continue, perhaps escalating further as each attempt failed. In preparation, I authorized a comprehensive audit of all projects and decisions James had been involved with during his time at Halcyon. Not for retribution, but for protection. I needed to understand any vulnerabilities he might exploit next. The audit revealed what I had suspected. Several questionable decisions buried under layers of organizational approval, financial arrangements that bordered on improper, and client promises that had never been fulfilled. James had left landmines throughout the organization, whether deliberately or through incompetence. I spent the next week methodically addressing each issue, correcting problems before they could explode, reaching out to affected clients with solutions rather than excuses. It was exhausting but necessary work, transforming potential crises into demonstrations of the new Halcyon's commitment to integrity and accountability. By the end of the month, James's campaign of undermining had largely collapsed. Each attack had been met with such overwhelming evidence and positive counteractions that he had lost credibility with the industry contacts he was trying to influence. The escalation challenge had been met and overcome not through matching his tactics but by demonstrating through actions what the new Halcyon stood for. In attempting to tear down what I had built, James had inadvertently provided opportunities to make it stronger, more transparent, and more respected than before. As Walter observed when we reviewed the situation, some leaders are defined by the enemies they defeat. The best ones are defined by how they defeat them. 3 months after taking official control of Halcyon Technologies, I received an unexpected meeting request from my father. Since his abrupt retirement, we had communicated only through lawyers regarding the financial arrangements of his departure. This direct outreach marked a significant shift. We agreed to meet at a neutral location, a private dining room at the Windsor Hotel downtown, far from both Halcyon's offices and my father's home. As I arrived, I found him already seated, looking older than when I had last seen him, but somehow more settled. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," he said as I took my seat across from him. No embrace, no warmth, but a genuine acknowledgement. "Of course," I replied, unsure what to expect from this encounter. After ordering coffee, my father got directly to the point, a trait I had inherited from him. "I've been following Halcyon's progress," he said. "The security initiative was impressive, the new healthcare vertical expansion even more so. The stock price is up 22% since you took over." I nodded, accepting the assessment without comment. These were facts, not opinions, and they spoke for themselves. "I underestimated you," he continued, the admission clearly difficult for him. "Not just your capabilities, which I should have recognized given your education and intelligence, but your commitment to Halcyon itself." The acknowledgement surprised me. My father had never been one to admit error, particularly when it involved his judgment of others. "I appreciate that," I said simply. "I'm not here to ask for my position back," he clarified. "That chapter is closed, but I would like to understand something that has troubled me." "What's that?" "Why did Clarence choose you? Not just over James, which I can now understand given the outcomes, but over me. What did he see that I missed for so many years?" The question held genuine pain and confusion. My father had always believed himself to be the true inheritor of my grandfather's vision, the rightful steward of his legacy. Learning otherwise had shaken his fundamental understanding of his place in the world. I considered how to answer truthfully without being unnecessarily cruel. "Grandfather once told me that there are 2 types of business leaders," I began carefully. "Those who see a company as something they possess, and those who see it as something they serve. He believed you saw Halcyon as a possession, something that conferred status and authority. He wanted someone who would serve its purpose instead." My father absorbed this, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "And you see it that way? As something to serve rather than possess?" "I see it as a responsibility," I replied, "to our clients who depend on our solutions, to our employees who commit their careers to our success, to the legacy grandfather created, which deserves to continue evolving rather than calcifying." He nodded slowly. "James doesn't understand that distinction. He never has." The acknowledgement of my brother's limitations was perhaps the most surprising part of our conversation. For the first time, my father was seeing James clearly, without the filter of paternal preference. "He's struggling," my father continued. "The connections he thought would provide easy opportunities have proven less receptive than expected. It turns out that reputation matters more than he realized. And relationships built on substance rather than social convenience," I added. "Yes." My father looked down at his coffee cup. "I did him no favors by promoting him beyond his capabilities. I see that now." The admission hung between us, an acknowledgement of the flawed judgment that had shaped both our lives in different ways. My advancement had been hindered by the same bias that had artificially elevated James. "What will you do now?" I asked, genuinely curious about his plans. "I've accepted a position on the board of the Symphony Foundation," he said. "Not business, but something meaningful. Your mother always wanted me to get more involved in the arts." The mention of my mother, who had passed away when I was in college, brought a momentary softness to our conversation. She had been the balance to my father's rigidity, the compassion to his ambition. I had often wondered how different our family dynamic might have been had she lived. "She would have been proud of you," my father said unexpectedly. "She always said you had Clarence's vision and her determination. I should have listened to her more carefully." This was the closest to an apology I would likely ever receive, and I accepted it as such. "Thank you." As our meeting concluded, we reached a kind of peace. Not warm reconciliation, but mutual recognition. The definitive resolution of our conflict had come not through legal maneuvers or business tactics, but through the undeniable reality of results. My father stood to leave, then paused. Halcyon means peaceful or tranquil in Greek. Clarence chose the name deliberately, believing that technology should bring calm to complexity. "You're honoring that vision better than I did." With those words, he departed, leaving me with the realization that some victories don't feel like triumphs, but like the quiet settling of things into their proper place. The definitive resolution wasn't just about who controlled Halcyon. It was about validating the vision that had guided me through years of patient work and calculated patience. My grandfather had been right all along. Halcyon's true strength wasn't in power or position, but in purpose. And that purpose was now secure in the hands of someone who understood it completely. 6 months after taking official control of Halcyon Technologies, I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, watching the sunset paint the city skyline, in gold and amber. The view was the same one my father and grandfather had gazed upon, but what I saw was fundamentally different. Not just a landscape, but a future unfolding. The transformation of Halcyon under my leadership had exceeded even my own expectations. Our market valuation had increased by 40%. Our client retention rate had reached an unprecedented 97%. Our innovation pipeline was filled with promising technologies that would shape industries for years to come. But the most meaningful changes weren't reflected in metrics or stock prices. They lived in the culture that now defined us. A meritocracy where ideas were valued regardless of their source, where collaboration replaced competition, where purpose drove decisions rather than personality or politics. I thought about the journey that had brought me here. 5 years of working in the shadows, building influence without recognition, transforming systems without credit. The painful moment of dismissal that had finally pushed me to claim what was rightfully mine. The confrontations and challenges that followed, each one strengthening rather than weakening my resolve. The lessons had been profound, some bitter, others illuminating. Power doesn't always announce itself with title or position. Sometimes, the quietest person in the room holds the most significant influence. Patience isn't passive, it's strategic. Waiting for the right moment requires more discipline than reacting to every slight or challenge. True leadership isn't about being seen, but about results, visible or invisible, acknowledged or unrecognized. The relationships once fractured by confrontation had evolved in unexpected ways. My father and I maintained a distant but respectful connection, meeting occasionally for brief conversations about Halcyon's progress. James had finally found a position better suited to his actual talents, heading public relations for a mid-sized firm where his social skills and presentation abilities were assets rather than substitutes for deeper capabilities. Cora had surprised everyone by proving herself invaluable as COO, her ambition channeled productively into operational excellence once she recognized that performance rather than politics would determine her advancement. Most importantly, I had found my authentic leadership voice, no longer hiding my capabilities or diminishing my vision to accommodate others' expectations. The woman once dismissed as just the secretary now spoke with clear authority, her worth proven not through inheritance or appointment, but through demonstrable results. As I turned away from the window and back to my desk, my eyes fell on a small framed photograph my grandfather in his workshop, a young me perched beside him as he explained some technical concept, both of us absorbed in the discussion. He had seen my potential long before anyone else, had quietly prepared me for this role when others weren't looking. "You were right, grandfather," I said softly to the image. "Sometimes the most power comes from being underestimated." The secretary had become the CEO. The silent architect had claimed credit for her designs. The patient strategist had revealed her long game. And Halcyon Technologies, my company, my responsibility, my legacy, was stronger for the transformation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.